Hey, all you cool cats and kittens, it's your favorite history teacher back at you again with another historical video. And today we finish our final lecture of the year of the unit. It's done. Done, done, done. All right, let's get into it. Okay, it'd help if I had it open. Hold on. Technical glitch. There we go. There we go. Do, 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 do. I just had it on another tab. So today we are going to finish off talking about Latin America during the Cold War, beyond, during. Um, Chapter 14, Lesson 4, we've talked about the South and Southeast Asia. We've talked about the Middle East, Southwestern Asia, and Africa, the whole continent. Now we're going to talk about Latin America. Latin America is basically Mexico all the way down to the tip of South America, Chile, Argentina. All right, so areas we got to talk about. There are 100 slides in this presentation. Let's get started. We're going to summarize the economic status of Latin American economies, and their relationship to the United States, and describe how the 20th century Latin American writers and artists explored new themes and techniques and often expressed their hopes of the people in their work. That was your warm up. All right, in debt. So, since the 1800s, Latin Americans have exported raw materials and bought manufactured goods from industrialized countries. Basing an economy on the export of a limited number of raw materials resulted in many issues for countries in the region, as the price paid for raw materials around the world market can vary. For example, the Great Depression caused exports to fall and revenues to buy manufactured goods decline. And in response, Latin Americans developed industries to produce their own goods. Smart. Let's not rely on the United States, right? By the 1960s, Latin American countries were still experiencing economic problems. They depended on the US, Europe, and Japan, especially for the advanced technology needed for modern industries. The many Latin American countries had failed to find markets abroad to sell their manufactured goods. And these economic failures lead to political instability. In the 1960s, repressive military regimes in Chile, Brazil, Argentina abolished political parties and returned to export import economies financed by foreigners. These regions also encouraged multinational corporations, which are companies with divisions in more than two countries, to come to Latin America. This made these Latin American countries even more dependent on industrialized nations. In the 1970s, Latin American countries tried to maintain their weak economies by borrowing money. In between 1970 and 82, 12 years, debt to foreigners grew from $27 billion to over $315.3 billion. A number of Latin American economies began to crumble, wages fell, unemployment skyrocketed, and as the economy declined, people still continue to move from the countryside to the cities. So this is Latin America, and I think these are where coup. So if you look at this area, there this icon means there was a coup. This icon means it was a failed coup. This icon means there are assassinations. This icon means a failed assassination. Red means Foco Wars. I don't know what that means. Uh, Yellow means urban guerrilla warfare, and purple means revolution. So Latin America, these are Latin American countries and their GDP value, gross domestic product. All right, democracy. So several states endured periods of upheaval and civil war during the 80s. Conflicts eased in the 90s, but many of these issues still lingered. Discord between indigenous peoples and mestizos, as well as political disagreements among conservatives and more left leaning parties, have long plagued the region. Economies reflected the disagreements of many leaders, struggled to find footing in either socialist or capitalist economies. However, with the debt crisis in the 80s, a movement toward democracy will emerge. Some military leaders cannot deal with their nation's debt problems. Meanwhile, many realized that military power without consent could not maintain a strong state. And as a result, a movement towards democracy was the most notable trend of the 80s and the early 90s in Latin America. Even as some states remained under military control, others moved towards civilian governments and held popular, free, multi party elections. Costa Rica, with its constitution in 1949, is one of the most stable and democratic countries in the region. Peru reestablished constitutional rule in 1979 with elections in 1980. It has maintained a relatively stable democracy despite a number of issues in the 90s. Through participation in the global economy, both Peru and Costa Rica have continued to achieve economic growth. That's nice to see. Here you have a democracy index where, I mean, this is from the Economist Intelligence Unit. So just, being a little biased. And as you can see, a full democracy is found in Uruguay. Everywhere else, Chile has like a flawed to full democracy. Panama, Costa Rica, all right, but this is in 2017, people. So don't get it twisted. And here are some protests. That's the Costa Rican flag. This is a video in I can't think. I think this is a movie about a video clip about Peru. It's like 12 minutes long, I think. All right, like a good neighbor. So the United States has always played a large role in Latin America ever since Teddy Roosevelt in 1900s. In 1948, the states of the Western Hemisphere formed the Organization of American States, OAS, which called for the end to military action by one state in the affairs of another state. The formation of the OAS did not end interference of the U.S. in Latin American affairs. As the Cold War developed, so too did the anxiety of U.S. policymakers about the possibility of communist regimes in Central America and the Caribbean. As a result, the U.S. returned to a policy of taking action when it believed Soviet agents were trying to set up governments hostile to U.S. interests, because, we don't want to lose our influence. There are 56 U.S. military interventions in Latin America. Pause this video if you want to read the infograph. All right, America's military is there. Get it? See, like a good neighbor, America is there. After Fidel Castro created a Marxist state in Cuba, the desire of the United States to prevent another Cuba largely determined on U.S. policy toward Latin America. In the 60s, President John F. Kennedy's Alliance for Progress encouraged social reform and economic development in Latin America. It was hoped that economic growth would keep people happy and less inclined to follow radical leaders. But the Alliance for Progress failed to work, however. Much of the money intended for economic development just ended up in the pockets of the rich. So when Cuba began to start guerrilla wars in other Latin American countries, the U.S. reacted by sending massive military aid to anti-communist regimes, regardless of their nature. As long as they weren't communist, we supported them. And in the 80s and 90s, the U.S. will return to a policy of direct intervention in Latin American affairs. And that's the U.S. military. Those are the brothers, Fidel and Raul Castro. All right, Mexico. So the Mexican Revolution in the early 1900s created a political order that remained stable for many years. The official party of the Mexican Revolution, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or PRI, came to dominate Mexico every 6 years. The leaders of the PRI chose the party's presidential candidate, who was then elected by the people. Almost like a puppet, you know? Almost like a cartel. During the 1950s and 60s, steady economic growth led to real gains in wages in Mexico. And at the end of the 60s, student protests against Mexico's one party government led to change. Two presidents, Luis Echeverria and Jose Lopez Portillo, made political reforms and new political parties emerged. Greater freedom of debate in the press and universities was allowed. The 60s were just like it's not just in America that the 60s were tumultuous. All right. Here's the PRI. This is a picture and of when it was founded. That's Echeverria on the left and Portillo on the right. These are student protests. In the 70s, vast new reserves of oil were discovered in Mexico. The government became more dependent on revenues from foreign oil sales. Then, when the world oil prices dropped in the mid 80s, Mexico was no longer able to make payments on its foreign debt. The government adopted new economic policies, one of which was privatization, the sale of the government owned companies to private firms. President Carlos Salinas de Gortari sped up privatization to relieve the debt crisis in 1992. De Gortari began working with the U.S. President and the Canadian Prime Minister to form the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. It went into effect in 1994. I don't know if it's still around. You have to check with the orange man. Uh, yeah, privatization. I think that's De Gortari. All right, Cuba again. So in the 50s, an opposition movement arose in Cuba. Again, you're going to learn about the Cuban Revolution again, like the third time in a row. It aimed to overthrow the government of dictator Fulgencio Batista, who controlled Cuba since 1933. The leader of this new government was a man named Fidel Castro. In 1954, Fidel and his brother Raul teamed up with a small band of revolutionaries. As rebels gained more support, the Batista regime collapsed. Castro's revolutionaries seized Havana June 3rd, 1959. Many who disagreed with Castro fled to the United States, and relations between Cuba and the U.S. quickly deteriorated when Castro's regime began to receive aid from the Soviet Union. Stop me if this doesn't sound similar to what we've already taken notes on. In October 1960, the U.S. declared a trade embargo with Cuba. Just 3 months later, all diplomatic relations with Cuba were broken. After the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis, Cuba became less dependent on the Soviet Union and pursued a new strategy of fomenting revolution in the rest of Latin America. Although Cuba's strategy failed, Castro's Marxist regime continued, but with mixed revolution. The Cuban people did secure some social gains, such as free medical services for all citizens with improvement in education. Illiteracy was nearly eliminated. The brothers again. That's Fidel and Khrushchev. All right, Haitian democracy. After American troops left Haiti in 1934, Haitians made several efforts to move toward democracy in 57. Elections controlled by the military. Francois Duvalier became president. He created a private militia, established dictatorial rule, and terrorized the country, killing tens of thousands of people. After his death in 1971, his son continued to rule Haiti with an iron fist. Growing opposition led to his rule led to the collapse of his regime in 86, followed by 5 years later, a return to democracy with the election of Jean-Bertrand Aristide. That's Duvalier. Those are Haitians. These are Haitians getting attacked. All right, Central 7. So, if you didn't know, Central America includes 7 countries: Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, Panama, Belize, Guatemala. Economically, Central America is dependent on the export of bananas, coffee, and cotton. Prices for these products have varied over time, creating economic crises. In addition, there is a huge gulf between a wealthy elite and poor peasant, creating a climate of instability in the regime. Plus, you need to know this one. I mean, I don't even know why, but I made it so big that you couldn't forget about it. The U.S. fear of the spread of communism led to the U.S. support for repressive regimes in Central America. Just because they weren't communist or had socialist leanings, they were supported by the United States, no matter how much of a dictator they were. Central America. Is this tomorrow? All right, the CIA. So in 54, with the support of the U.S., Jacobo Arbenz of Guatemala was overthrown in a series of military dominated dictators and ruled the country for years. Guerrilla forces began forming to oppose the government, which responded in the early 80s by using military action and economic reforms to defeat the guerrillas. As in El Salvador, right wing death squads in Guatemala began attacking anyone who they believed belonged to the opposition, especially the indigenous people of Guatemala, the descendants of the ancient Mayan peoples. The government, over time, will kill as many as 200,000 people, mostly unarmed Mayans. And it's all about the United Fruit Company and them losing access to getting their bananas. So the CIA overthrows Arbenz because he didn't want to keep selling products and getting, shafted by the United States. So that's Arbenz. And that's, oh, what's his name? I think his name is Armas, something Castillo Armas. This is a painting. I wish I had the description of it, but this is Eisenhower, if you can't tell. You can't tell. And so these are mothers of deceased or unfound sons, husbands, parents, dead bodies. I mean, you have all these protests and people are still trying to find their kids. I believe this had to happen within the last 5 years because these women are wearing masks. 1982, 1995. So, it's been a while. All right, Civil Salvador. So, after World War II, the wealthy elite and military controlled the government in El Salvador. A rise of the urban class led to hope for a more democratic government. The army refused to accept the result of free elections held in 1972. However, world attention then focused on El Salvador in the late 70s and 80s as the country was rocked by civil war. Marxist-led leftist guerrillas and right-wing groups battled one another. The Catholic Church became a main target, and a number of priests were killed or tortured, among them Archbishop Oscar Romero. The U.S. began to provide weapons and trainings to the Salvadoran army to defeat the guerrillas. The hope was to bring stability to the country, but killings continued until a 1992 peace settlement ended the war. Crazy. I never even knew that. And when I learned about this in El Salvador, I mean, I don't know if these are the two groups, but I looked up leftist groups and I looked right wing groups, and this is on the left, the FMLN, and I have no idea if this is the correct group, but dead bodies. Cold Nicaragua. In Nicaragua, the Somoza family seized control of the government in 1937 and maintained control over the next 43 years. Over most of the period, the Somoza regime had the support of the United States. The Somozas enriched themselves at the expense of the Nicaraguan people and used murder and torture to silence opposition. In 1979, the U.S., under President Jimmy Carter, grown unwilling to support this corrupt regime. In the same year, Marxist guerrillas known as the Sandinista National Liberation Front won a number of military victories against the government forces and gained control of the country. Soon, a group of opposed the Sandinistas' policies called the Contras, and they began to overthrow the new government. Worried by Sandinistas' alignment with Soviet Union, the U.S. supported the Contras. The war waged by the Contras undermined the support of the Sandinistas. In 1990, the Sandinistas, led by Daniel Ortega, agreed to free elections and lost to a coalition headed by Violeta Barrios de Chamorro, who became Nicaragua's first female president. This is the original Anastasio Somoza, and you can tell by the family tree. This is how they're all related. Daniel Ortega is a part of the Somoza family. Interesting enough. There you go. Sandinistas, Contras, and this is how the U.S. funded in the 80s. All right, Chile. So the history of Chile has mirrored the experience of other Latin American countries. However, it took a dramatic step in the in 1970 when Salvador Allende, a Marxist, became president. Allende's election led many to believe it would warm relations between the Chile and Soviet Union failed to happen, however. USSR's relations with the Cold War opponent, U.S., turned cold. Allende tried to create a social society through constitutional means. His first steps were to increase wages and nationalize the largest corporations. Nationalization of the copper industry angered the company's owners in the U.S., as well as the U.S. government. Allende gained support of the Chilean Congress while doing this. But General Augusto Pinochet moved to overthrow the government in 1973, and military forces killed Allende and set up a dictatorship. And the Pinochet regime is one of the most brutal in Chile's history. Thousands of opponents were imprisoned, tortured, or murdered. The regime also outlawed all political parties and did away with the Congress. These horrible abuses of human rights led to growing unrest in the mid 80s. Thousands of Pinochet's opponents and other civilians were arrested and never seen again. Pinochet finally lost in 1989 in a free presidential election. South America, that's Allende. That's copper. That's him dying. And this is Pinochet on the right. And this is under Pinochet. Argentina. In Latin America, it is Latin America's second largest country. For years, Argentina has been ruled by a powerful oligarchy whose wealth is based on growing wheat and raising cattle. Support from the army was crucial to continuing this power of the oligarchy. In 1943, during World War II, a group of army officials overthrew the oligarchy. The new regime was not sure how to deal with the working classes, however. Juan Perón devised a new strategy under his position as labor secretary in the military government. Perón sought to win over the workers known as the descamisados, the shirtless ones. He encouraged them to join labor unions and increase job benefits. In 46, Juan Perón was elected president of Argentina, and his chief support came from labor and urban middle classes. His wife, Eva Perón, was adored by many Argentines and was a major part of the Perón regime. Together, the Perons brought social reforms to Argentina. That's the leader before Perón. That's Perón and his wife. There you go, descamisados. All right, to please his supporters from labor and the middle classes, Perón followed a policy of increased industrialization. He sought to free Argentina of foreign investors. The government bought the railways and took over banking, insurance, shipping, and communications industries. Perón's regime was also authoritarian. He created fascist gangs that used violent means to terrify his opponents. The military will overthrow Perón in 1955, and he went into exile in Spain. Overwhelmed by problems, the military leaders later allowed him to return. He was reelected as president in 73, but died a year later. In 76, the military once again took power. The new regime tolerated no opposition. It is believed that around 36,000 people were killed. In 1982, the military regime invaded the Falkland Islands off the coast of Argentina. Great Britain, which had controlled the islands since the 1800s, sent ships and troops to take back the islands. This loss discredited the military and opened the door to civilian rule in Argentina. When Raúl Alfonsín was elected president in 83, he restored democracy and prosecuted the former military leaders. Right on, Raúl. Here's some pictures. Lots of pictures. Pictures on pictures. All right. Colombia has long had democratic political system, but its conservative elite were led by the owners of coffee plantations that dominated the government. Coffee is an important crop from Colombia, making up about half the country's legal exports. Yet, because the economy relies heavily on the coffee trade, price fluctuations have created negative impact on the overall economy. In addition to the economic problems, political problems troubled Colombia in the 20th century. After World War II, Marxist guerrilla groups began to organize Colombian peasants. The government responded violently. More than 200,000 peasants have been killed by the 60s, and violence will continue throughout the 80s and 90s. Those are coffee beans. Those are the gorillas, 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 dead people. Narcos. So peasants who lived in poverty turned to a new cash crop, cocoa leaves, which are used to make cocaine. As the lucrative drug trade grew, two major cartels formed in Colombia. The drug cartels used bribes and violence to force government cooperation in the drug traffic and dominated the market. Colombia became the major cocaine supplier of the international drug market. Violence increased as rebel guerrillas made deals with cartels to oppose the government. The government will use an aerial eradication program to try and wipe out cocoa fields, but the program did not have much success despite the money earned from the drug and coffee exports. The Colombian economy remains weak because of high unemployment and the disruption of potential civil war. Those are cocoa leaves. I looked up the process of how to make cocaine. That picture showed up in the top right, and that is the drug on the bottom. These are where cocoa cultivation is. So Bogota and Cali, and Medellin. Remember? These are the actual bad guys, and that is one Pablo Escobar. Pablo Escobar. Narcos. All right, mega. So Latin America's economic problems have been made worse by its dramatic rise in population. Both Latin America and North America, US and Canada, had the same population in the 1950s, around 165 million people. But the mid 80s, Latin America's population exploded to 400 million people, while North America was just 270 million. With the increase in population came rapid rise of the size of cities. By 1990, there are more than 29 cities with more than 1 million people. Mexico City and Sao Paulo each had over 10 million people, and analysts refer to those as mega cities. Test question. Mega cities in Latin America have often grown so fast that regular urban services cannot provide for them. Latin American women's roles also have changed. Although the traditional role of homemaker continues, women have also moved into new jobs. In addition to working on farms, women have found jobs in industry, teachers, professors, doctors, and lawyers. These are where most people live in 2015 along the coastlines. And here are some of the most populous cities. I studied abroad in this little city, Belo Horizonte, which is one of the 17th largest cities in America. Within city limits. City limits. That's Rio de Janeiro. That's a mega city. I just searched up mega city. That's Belo Horizonte or Belo Horizonte, where I studied abroad. And this is the little area called Pampulha, where the neighborhood I lived in. Escrito. So 20th century Latin American writers and artists have played important roles in their society. Their work is seen as expressing the hopes of their people. And because of this, artists and writers hold high values in Latin American society. In the 40s, Latin American writers developed a unique form of expression called magic realism. Magic realism brings together the realistic events with dreamlike or fantasy backgrounds. The rules of ordinary life are suspended in order to comment on a national or social situation. Perhaps the foremost example of magic realism, A Hundred Years of Solitude, a novel by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, a Colombian writer who won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1982. In this story of a fictional town called Macondo, the point of view slipped back and forth between fact and fantasy. According to Marquez, fantasy and fact depend on one's point of view. Latin American art and architecture were strongly influenced by international styles after World War II. Perhaps the most notable example of modern architecture can be seen in Brasilia, capital of Brazil, which is built in the 50s and 60s. Brazilian architect Oscar Niemeyer was appointed chief architect of the new capital. That's Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I looked it up. I think they're making something on Netflix about this. When you look up 100 Years of Solitude, this is Brasilia. I did not go there. And these are military coups within the region of all the countries, excluding Mexico. So the U.S. was all over the place. Okay. And yeah, that's going to conclude. That's going to conclude it, people. We are done. I know I started talking faster. I mean, like I said, 100 slides are in this presentation. So I wanted to get it under 30 minutes. I don't think I did, but I think it's under 30 minutes. So I'm going to stop talking. Your homework, your last homework assignment of the year is to do page 543, 2 through 4. All right, page 543, 2 through 4. So, yeah, we're done. We're done. We made it. All right. If you guys did enjoy that, make sure you hit that like button, leave a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you next year. Peace.